Hi guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Shane, and I help individuals and companies think through their toughest problems. Before making YouTube videos, I was working in the tech industry for companies like Google and Niantic Labs and various startups. Most recently, I was the head of business operations at Sturfy, a Metaverse startup focused on world-scale augmented reality. I closed multi-year deals worth millions of dollars across the US, Japan, Korea, China, and the Middle East. All this was for a product so new that it didn't have an existing market yet, a literal 0 to 100 scenario. In this video, I'll cover what new product market discovery and business development is like, and also give you a few tips based on my experience in the trenches. Just a heads up that this video is primarily aimed at entrepreneurs, CEOs, strategists, and business and product managers, but also really useful if you're looking to get into the tech industry or wanting to think more strategically. So this is a very brief overview of what BD or business development is like, and I don't have the time to go into all the nuances in just 15 minutes or however long this video ends up being. If you guys have any specific questions, definitely shoot me an email on my website or leave a comment below. And if there is enough interest from you guys, I might consider actually making a whole series on how to run a startup. All right, guys, without further ado, let's hit it. All right, what is a startup? It might sound really obvious, but it is such a fundamental question that not a lot of people ask themselves before joining one. A very experienced tech veteran once told me that a startup is great for discovery, whereas a big corporation or company is good for implementation or scaling. And what a startup is trying to discover are two things. The first one is the validation of the value hypothesis, right? This is essentially learning about the market and trying to find product market fit. For example, Uber started off with a hypothesis of ride sharing is something that a lot of people would need, and it has potential of replacing taxis as on-demand transportation for people within cities, right? So that is a hypothesis of a market need. And then the product itself then is, or the startup is a vehicle to trying to discover or validate whether this is true. The second thing that's trying to discover is a working business model, because it's not enough to just identify a need or demand. You actually have to figure out how to make money, how to make profit, because that essentially is what a business is, right? You can have the greatest need or the greatest demand, but if you are not sustainable as a business, then you're out of the market. So that working business model of how to monetize, how to make profit is critical essentially to what that discovery part is too. All right, what is business development, BD? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is developing new business, right? It is trying to figure out how you're going to approach the market, who you're going to sell to, how you're going to sell it, how much to charge, and then closing deals at the end of the day. Not just deals, but also, getting signups for your service or product, right? Depending on what company or what industry you're in. And I always like to use this analogy of ninjas versus samurai. So ninjas are stealthy. They are covert ops, essentially, that you send behind enemy lines, and they will figure out and do whatever it takes to reach their objective, right? They're constantly essentially learning about the terrain, what's going on the other side. Whereas samurai, they are essentially infantry, right? They go through the front door. They face the enemy or the market head on, and they follow a code. They're highly scalable because there is an existing process that already works. Essentially, ninjas are business development people, whereas samurai are like salespeople that you hire after your business developers have actually determined, hey, there is product market fit. They have validated the market demand for your service or product and have also figured out a viable way of monetizing, the monetization or business model, right? But not only that, have actually discovered a process that can be scaled. That's when you can essentially translate this into a process or a code to hire salespeople or samurai to execute on it. And who is usually the BD of a startup? Well, it should be the CEO or the founder first and foremost, because the person who hatched up the idea for the company or product in the first place should be the one taking the charge to actually validate it, become the main touch point with the market, with the users, and also create that feedback loop of essentially figuring out, hey, this is what people like, this is not like, and therefore we can actually translate it into product. So the CEO is often the business developer, the head business developer, the head product manager, and head everything, right, when you first begin. However, once you get it to a certain size, let's say 5 to 10 people, you might actually want to consider hiring a dedicated business developer or a business hire essentially to go to the market with. This will offload essentially a lot of the energies that the CEO can then now focus on fundraising or hiring, which is a key CEO job. And my experience is that I joined Sturfy when it was only 10 people. Everybody was an engineer. Everybody was a machine learning expert. And I came in as a jack of all trades, having done product, user operations, marketing, product design, and strategy. So they were essentially getting 5 people in one. And not only that, I was able to combine all these different hats, all these different mindsets into thinking much more strategically about how to sell or how to go to market than a typical salesperson or business developer, right? So essentially, the more diverse the background that you have as a business developer, the more resourceful you can be and more strategic that you can be as well. And as business developers, it's our job to figure out if the problem is painful enough for people to pay, big enough to support the company in the long term, aka market size, how to position yourself amongst competitors, the most effective narrative to sell based on your customers' fears, desires, identity, the right business model that align with all the interests, get enough cash essentially, right? To make sure that the company is surviving, if not thriving, and also validate enough of the market and the demand so that you can have the option to go fundraising from investors if necessary. That's a lot of responsibility, I'm not gonna lie. And that's the reason why you have to think from so many different angles. You can't just follow a set code like a samurai. You have to be very flexible, very resourceful, and very attentive and observative in order to figure out all these different nuances as a business developer and ninja. All right, guys, now I'm gonna give you some tips on how to become a great business developer. And like a lot of my videos, I actually plan everything out in a mind map fashion. So this is no different. And we're gonna go through at least 4 of these, right? The first one is know which product you're gonna go to market with. So when I first started at Sturfy, we actually had 2 products that were about to launch. It was either going to be either going to be a game, basically an AR location-based game similar to Pokemon Go and Ingress, or we're going to become a technology platform giving this AI cloud tool to other developers and engineers, game designers in order to create apps for. These are fundamentally very different products essentially go to market, right? And my first job was trying to figure out, okay, which one should we go with? And I set up a series of user interviews for our game with various different users and getting them into a room and actually going through a design audit as well as real-time game demo to try to figure out, okay, what is the feedback from it, right? And it very quickly became obvious that it was going to take a lot more resource than we had to make this game, this product, polished enough so that it would even stand a chance in the App Store. With this data, with this feedback, I was able to convince the managing team, the CEO, the CTO, and the product manager to actually let go of this particular product so that we can actually focus on launching a technology platform instead, which actually has way more optionality in the market because then we can actually diversify and try to figure out what kind of developers do we want to be on board, right? Rather than putting our eggs in one basket. So fortunately, we had that option to go off of. But definitely when you first start, think about which product, if you have multiple product ideas or multiple value propositions, which one you want to drill down first, right? And then do your homework and get user interviews to actually validate that hypothesis of your product. The second tip is know your vertical. A vertical is a specific industry or demographic that you're targeting, because you can't just boil the ocean, you can't sell to everybody, right? You just don't have as much resources in order to do that. You're not a big corporation, you're still in the discovery phase. You gotta know your customers. With Sturfy, we have 3 verticals that we could sell to for our AI engine, right? Our cloud service. And these are apps, devices, and infrastructure players. And all of them combined is kind of what I jokingly call the layer cake of the tech stack, right? So basically, all of these have pros and cons. And what we discover through the meetings and research is that we ended up having the best alignment with infrastructure players. And the reason is the application players like Facebook, Snapchat, and Google and Niantic Labs would actually see us as acquisition targets, right? Which created essentially a conflict of interest between us trying to sell to them versus them trying to buy us. So there was always this little dance that's going on there. But that also meant that they could open up early business, but actually scaling it to future contracts and longevity as business partners might actually be very challenging, right? So they were high priority, but not a super high priority. And then devices are like the Apples, the Samsungs, and before the China ban essentially was Huawei. These are mobile players that also had a huge incentive in augmented reality and the metaverse. So on the surface, it sounds like there was really good alignment, but then there was kind of poor business model alignment, because we're an AI service or software as a service, right? We actually sell based on the amount of engagement, whereas these players, the mobile players, actually are more used to licenses, right? You would pay based on the per device level rather than per API call or engagement level, essentially. Again, we could do early stage testing and stuff, but the longevity in terms of business model alignment, not so great. And then finally, we have the infrastructure players, right? Specifically, telecommunication companies are rolling out 5G and need essentially these new applications to take advantage of the new infrastructure. And it quickly became obvious that our business models were aligned, because they are an infrastructure player, we are an infrastructure player. They sell based on subscriptions. We can actually bundle our service on top of the subscriptions and work together in tackling a new market, right? And there's also a heavy need for it as well. Basically, you want to figure out your possibility of verticals and then really drill down into which vertical makes the most sense for you. And what that means is how I like to prioritize, going back to my mind map, is figuring out the prioritization, right? The market size. The market size is key, because even if they have a really big demand, you don't have that market size, then you can't actually generate enough revenue to make it worthwhile to create a business around, or even to fundraise, right? And convince your investors that this is a big enough opportunity. The second one is, who is the most hurt? This means 2 things, right? It could either be competitive pressures, or that it's, these guys or your customers might be down in a slump. They were really good before and now they're not, and they're looking to pivot. They're looking for new revenue streams, right? So these things are really critical. The competitive pressures are key, primarily because that's going to drive how much anxiety or how much incentive they are to get moving. If they're very comfortable or have a monopoly position in the market, it's like a lazy tiger in a zoo. They're definitely not going to go out and hunt, right? They're just going to sit there and be fed. Then the next one is, who is the most willing to pay, right? How much margin do they generate actually as a business for your company, for your customers? If they actually have a cash cow, let's say an advertising, like a Google, right? They have a ton of money that they actually are willing to, spray and pray and try to figure out, hey, which one is going to stick? That's going to work to your advantage because they actually have extra cash to spend. And also, what is the business model you want to go with, right? Again, it goes back to the business model. Is it going to be a one-off SOW, or basically a proof of concept, POC? Or is it going to be a recurring revenue subscription model where you're going to get month over month revenue year after year, right? Which is far more stable than one-off sales. So, is there appetite for subscription-based or recurring revenue? Very, very, very important. And then the next one is, what about risk and conflict of interest? As I mentioned earlier, we found out that the application companies looked at us as acquisition targets, right? Why buy from you when we can actually buy you as a company? So when there is a conflict of interest, that actually increases the risk of business too, because you actually have to think a little bit more about, hey, what is the strategic angle of these large companies? Are they just mining you for information, or are they actually genuinely wanting to buy from you? And also risk, essentially. Some companies or territories are going to be more risky than others. For example, when we were operating within China, they wanted us to have all our AI servers essentially within China, right? And that increased the risk by a lot because it wasn't going to be, Amazon Cloud Services, AWS, or Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud. It was going to be somewhere that was, less transparent, far less control, and much more likely for, something bad essentially to happen as well, right? Just lack of transparency and higher risk. These are all the questions you really got to ask yourself. And not only that, think about the dynamics between all the different vertical players, right? How can you actually influence one of the stack based on the activities of someone else in there? So for example, in infrastructure, right? One of the reasons why we're able to sell to telcos, major telcos basically all the major telcos we were talking to, essentially, is that they didn't want to be overtaken by the application companies because they kind of missed the boat around 4G and 5G and the mobile era. If you're old enough to remember, we were paying for text plans back then. And then Messenger came along, iMessage, WhatsApp, right? That completely displaced that whole, you pay the phone company or the telco company for that privilege. So that's just one example of being overtaken. And now the telcos are essentially commoditized, or their pricing power has been decreased so much that they're a minor player of sorts in this whole digital age. And a lot of that is carrying over, that fear is carrying over to the 5G era. So we were able to essentially position ourselves as the telco-friendly AI company that could work directly with them and within their infrastructure without posing a threat to them in the future, like a Google or a Facebook or even Apple, right? And that it would be a much more collaborative experience on equal grounds rather than adversarial down the line. So really understand the competitive dynamics. And if you're operating on an international level, for example, for us, I was able to close business deals in Japan and then convince Koreans essentially to jump on as well, because everybody's looking at each other, right? If you can get a few major deals closed or customers, you can actually essentially think about, how to actually display this or market signal to other players that, hey, you're a legitimate service provider, that you should trust me, and that, I'm able to sell this product essentially to you because all your competitors or your buddies, right, are into this product. So it is the kind of B2B or business to business equivalent of user testimonials. Man, I've been talking real fast for a bit. If you have enjoyed this video so far, definitely like or subscribe, because I'm going to be one of these YouTubers telling you to like and subscribe, because it actually does help this channel out a lot, right? All right, tip number 3 is selling to a customer. Once you've identified your vertical, which one you want to approach, and have a pretty solid understanding, now you're going to actually make a short list of the highest probability customers, right, that you can find. With that short list, you're going to have to reach out to them, book those first meetings, however you can. And before your first meeting and during the subsequent meetings, you're trying to figure out essentially a few things, the need to knows, right? You got to know their business model, because that's going to fuel essentially, your arguments for around greed or why they want to buy you, the market position, which is more competitive around competitive fears, right? What their future plans are, because then you can actually use some of the vocabulary that they're using in order to communicate to them, because that's the only way. You got to speak their language, right? And then there's identity, which is often shaped by the founders or the key decision makers within the company that you're talking to, right? Each department, depending on how big the company that you're working with is, will have a different personality. So you're going to have to know their style as well, right? And then finally, the key decision makers, because often the person that you're the first point of contact with within a larger company or your client, they're often not they're like sourcing agents, right? They're trying to look for solutions to market, but they actually can't make the decision to buy from you right there and then. They actually need to escalate it up to the right teams. So always ask yourself, if you're talking to the right decision maker, the end decision maker of, if you're going to be able to make that deal done. And right now, let me give you an example of just how deep that I go, right, as a business developer. When I was looking into, let's say, the Metaverse customers, right, the application companies, Snapchat and Facebook, I went as far as mapping out their entire platform. For example, what is the nature of Snapchat's focus? What is their long-term views, right? Well, they've got the social angle, they've got the hardware angle. They're also pursuing an open ecosystem with other developers so they can actually create lens and face filters. And then from a strategic angle, it's like, okay, can I compare Snapchat to Facebook? Because they are competitors, right? How are they each trying to expand beyond just their core business of ads and social, right? Maybe for Facebook, it's IG and WhatsApp. They also have, in real life stuff. And then for Snapchat, it's Bitmojis, gamings, the Lens Studios, and open platform. And a lot of the differentiation will really help me to be informed in my conversations with my counterparts. And then, what is Snapchat's open platform? Well, I mapped out essentially that this is the entire ecosystem that they're trying to create with like content creators going onto Snapchat, creating Lens, and then for their users to engage with, right? And constantly I'm asking myself, okay, where do we as Sturfy fit into this whole flow, right? Can we actually, as a world scale AR platform, can we enable Snapchat to, create essentially city scale augmented reality experiences? When you hold up your phone, you're able to play like a game down an alleyway, right? Or have these billboards pop up essentially before you in cities. So these are the things that our technology enables, but I actually have to first understand the entire dynamic of where our product fits into the whole grand scheme of things. And this also is part of system thinking. You also have to pay attention to major market movements and events, like developer conferences like Google I/O or Apple's WWDC, right? These are announcements that can actually have industry-changing repercussions. You have to understand how these things are going to impact the other players in your market. So for example, when Facebook rebranded itself as Meta, right? There are a few things. It's going to cause a whole cascade of events and reactions from market players, like from competitors, right? It's going to force competitors to show their hand because holy crap, Facebook basically just changed their name into the Metaverse company. What is Snapchat going to do, right? Are they going to double down on what they do? So Snapchat actually said, nope, we're not going to be in the Metaverse. We're going to be AR. We're going to be augmented reality. And then Niantic, the Pokemon Go company, was like, well, we're not going to do the whole virtual reality thing. We're the real world Metaverse. So you have basically two augmented reality companies, giants in this field, going completely opposite ways, right? It's very important to actually determine where they're going so that when you actually pitch to them or try to sell to them, you know what approach to take, right? And then there's also investors. A lot of times it's like, hey, once you do a rebranding, investors might actually, come in. It creates a beacon for investors, employees, and also just like, talent and ecosystem players, right? The whole thing is that it'll bring this product to reality. The fact that, Facebook is basically creating a beacon saying, hey, we're going to be the Metaverse company. Everybody join on our boat. That's basically what it's signaling to the market, right? And there's a time scale, essentially, go to market time. Once that announcement happens, and if it's impacting you significantly of all your potential customers, this is the time in which you've got to move very, very quickly, right? In order to adapt to that shift. All right, let me now walk through an example of how I actually approach one particular customer, right? So as I mentioned earlier, we targeted large telecommunication companies, right? Like the Verizons of the world. So one of the deals that I closed was actually with KDDI, the second largest telecommunication company in Japan. And the way that I did it was actually going, okay, well, Of course, it's a mind map, right? These are the factors that I thought about. It is greed, fear, and other factors, right? These are the core motivations essentially of a particular customer, any customer for that matter. Well, with greed, it's about profit. Like, how do we appeal the profit driving incentives, right? So for that, you've got to understand, hey, what are their sources of revenue? How can we save them on cost? Because profit equals revenue minus cost, right? And then from there, I have to understand, okay, where are their main revenue sources coming from? Is it mobile subscriptions? And it turned out to be like 9% of the revenue, consumer, cloud services, which is business, and then new sources of new revenue that they're trying to develop, right? And a lot of this is actually coming from their financial reports. And this is actually how deep that I go in order to learn about their different business units, their revenue projections, their plans, learning the vocabulary of what they're using, right? You really got to get into the head of your customers. That's really key. On the cost side, it's for us, it's because we're a scalable AR platform. Therefore, it doesn't take a lot of money essentially to implement, right? So it's not exactly a cost saving, but it is cost effective. And you can definitely make that argument. And then from mobile subscription, now that I know 90% of their revenue comes from cellular plans, right? Like a lot of telcos do. Well, how do we increase their market share and how do we increase their average revenue per user? Because it's already a very saturated market in Japan, meaning that everybody who has a cell phone plan already has one. Therefore, all the three major telcos there are competitors are in gridlock, right? And in the United States, if you go onto Verizon's site or T-Mobile site, you're gonna see stuff like, hey, we're gonna pay you $500 in order to switch plans. That's basically the user acquisition cost, the cost of acquiring a new user for a telco, right? That's super important because knowing this means that, if we can make an argument around, hey, our AR service is going to differentiate you in the market with a premium, AR experience, dedicated AR app, or enhancing the usability essentially of your 5G infrastructure. And it's going to make move the needle from a market share perspective. How much is that worth? Well, if the cost of user acquisition is $500 a user, then even a movement of 1% market share, assuming that the market size is 99 million Japanese mobile users, it's going to be worth $500 million, right? That's huge. And we're going to be selling obviously our service to them at a fraction of the price. So you can really make that value to cost argument, essentially. And then it goes even further than that because depending on how we want to pitch to our customers, it's like, hey, if we're going down the dedicated AR app way, then you really have to understand why do people use apps in the first place? Why would they need an AR application? Well, the reason why people use apps is for three core reasons. It's either utility, because it's useful, entertainment, or it's a status, right? So from a utility standpoint, maybe it's like finding your way using augmented reality, AR navigation, having these arrows point out on the map in front of you, in front of your camera. Or is it entertaining like gaming, tourism, right? Music, sports, events. Or is it status, for example, like NFTs, which are super popular these days. Can you create these like cool AR NFTs that you can actually, show off in the public, right? Like a gallery, turn any building into essentially a gallery. These are all ideas in which, if we want to go down the dedicated AR app, we would actually put that into a pitch deck and then tell that story, right? Very different than we're trying to become a 5G AR platform. So really map out, these different options and the different factors that go into these options. And this is where mind mapping is so useful. I'm not going to go into like the fears, but you'll get a sense here, and I'm happy to share this on my website as well. So you can actually take a look at this also. After you have done your initial research or even have closed a deal with the customer, your job is not done yet, right? Because there's always a lot more to learn. The closing of the deal is just the beginning. It's just trying to figure out, hey, this is, what some people is willing to pay for, but you got to continuously learn from every single meeting. Because what you're trying to do as a business developer at the end of the day is create a feedback loop between your company and the market, right? You're the closest contact to the market after all. For example, when we were working with KDI and a lot of the other telcos, I was constantly trying to map out, okay, these are what they're really looking for. Like if for an application, AR application, they're looking at sports, entertainment, and e-commerce, right? These are the learnings in which then we can execute on, see if they stick or not, and then I can actually use this in the next step, which is scaling. What scaling ultimately is just increasing the output, the business output, right? Based on all the learnings you've had previously and creating a system that can actually be replicated very easily and cost effectively. That's basically scaling. And in business development, scaling is actually coming up with a sales process that works. And you know it works based on your previous successes, right? But you have to systemize it so that you can actually hire, again, samurai or salespeople to execute on it. Because samurai, you can't expect them essentially to problem solve like a business developer. That's not their job. They're going to be really good at hunting and bringing back the prey, essentially. But you got to give them the right tools and the right knowledge to do that, right? And don't scale, don't hire salespeople until you have actually figured out a decent amount of product market fit, and also know your pipeline, like know your stack of verticals, right? Who you're going to sell to in those verticals, identify a hit list of sorts that you want to go down. And then only then should you be hiring salespeople to execute on that. I would say for the most part, the CEO, the core business developer, needs to take on that role. We are here to discover the market, and we're here to discover what our value is to the world. All right, guys, I've been talking for a real long time. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this was helpful. Again, it's really tough to actually go through all the nuances of business development in just like a few minutes. Definitely leave a comment, subscribe, and like this video, as it helps out the channel a lot. And if there's enough interest, let me know, because I can always create an entire series around running a startup, right? There's a lot of hats I used to wear. So, all right, guys, have a great one, and I will see you soon. Bye now.